After addressing a conference of bishops in the 1920s, the Lord Chancellor, F.E. Smith, perhaps Churchill's closest friend and no less self-confident than he, was asked by a friend how his talk had gone. And he replied, "I felt like a lion in a den of Daniels." Well, despite your flattering introduction, Mr. Chairman, I can't honestly feel I say exactly the same way. I'm slightly flattered and very intimidated to be here addressing an audience of people who are professionally concerned with seeing into people more deeply even than psychiatrists. My late NR colleague, Kate O'Byrne, was once asked if she would like an audience with Padre Pio, who, it was said, had the capacity of looking directly into the souls of his interlocutor. "Are you kidding?" she replied. "I'm saving that kind of thing for the day of judgment." Well, so am I, Mr. Chairman. And I ask you to treat what I say, therefore, as sort of innocent of theological knowledge and confined to secular observations and analysis. But they do, I think, as you will see, have very important implications for both national loyalties and for religious faith and for the nature of conservatism. I have to begin with that disclaimer because my topic is identity politics, and identity concerns the soul. And these remarks were stimulated in part, thank you so much, were stimulated in part by the results of the election. On election night, I tweeted out a little note saying one of the reasons for this election is because white Americans decided that identity politics can't be something reserved for everybody except them, and that they were being excluded from one of the elements of modern politics, and an element that's been growing more important for the last 30 to 40 years. And it has deep roots in our changing views of personality and society. So I've got to begin by digging a little deeper than the contemporary politics. I think it's fair to say that the growing or prevailing respectable concept of identity is that it's very largely malleable, a matter of personal choice in a world of socially constructed identities. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon, but it's developed so radically, the self being now seen as almost infinitely malleable, and has been so widely popularized, moving from the philosophy lecture room to the cinema, to the world of the play, and to the world of politics, that it's now challenging the much older concept of identity, which is built around ideas such as conscience and the soul. Look at this, think of it as of a movie, a science fiction movie in the 50s. The modern theory of identity has broken out of the philosophy room and is stalking through the town, inserting itself into the heads of regular citizens and transforming them into other directed aliens. Of course, both theories of identity start out with a great deal in common, namely that our individual identity is put together from three elements or three sets. The first is that set of psychological abilities which seem innate to all human beings and which become evident in the early years of childhood. I would say they are consciousness, memory, and the moral sense. Consciousness makes us aware of our existence separate from others. Memory extends that awareness backward through time, and the moral sense tells us the terms of what we've got to, how we must deal with each other. Together, these three things generate that aspect of ideas we call the conscience. This is more than just a voice telling us not to take wrong actions in the here and now. It makes us feel moral responsibility for past actions, and so helps identity to be established as something that exists through time. Let me illustrate this. You sometimes hear about a vicious criminal who in prison has undergone a moral transformation and performed great charitable or scholarly works. And it's then said that he should be released because he is, quote, clearly no longer the man who committed the crimes. Would the criminal himself agree with this? Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, tortured and killed several children, became a Christian in prison at one point. I'm not sure he remained one. He is on record as saying that someone who committed such crimes has indefinitely forfeited any right of release. Now, another criminal might, of course, wished to be released, but almost certainly on the grounds that he had purged his offences. If so, that would be an admission of a continuing moral responsibility and, in effect, a claim of identity extending through time. I would say the great likelihood is that criminals like the Birdman of Alcatraz, who did seem to experience this moral transformation, performed their good works precisely because they were the same men. They felt they were the same men who had committed the monstrous crimes, and they wanted to build up an equally impressive list of services on the moral side of the ledger. To use religious language, they wanted to atone. Now, conscience is common to all human beings except psychopaths and Yoram, editors. Memory, consciousness, and the moral sense are, however, only the first building blocks of identity. They make us aware of our individuality, but they don't alone constitute it. The second set of qualities making up our identity is our genetic inheritance from our particular parents. It's this inheritance that sets us on the road to being individuals by laying out our potential abilities, tastes, temperaments, and so on. Psychologists seem to have established that this inheritance is very rich and influential. We are, it seems, disposed by our individual genes to have a particular level of IQ, to enter particular occupations, to attend particular churches, to marry a particular kind of spouse, to be law-abiding or criminal, sane or mad, healthy or sick, friendly or suspicious, party animal or wallflower, long or short-lived, and even, as W.S. Gilbert put it, either a little liberal or a little conservative. And that brings us to the third element in identity, the influence of environment. Many of the most important components of our identity arise from our being born into a particular family, in a particular place, at a particular time in history, and therefore into a particular set of customs and traditions. To take the most intimate example, the first language we learn is an accident of birth. Our religious identity is something we embrace long before we can grasp its importance or its implications. Our sexuality is probably determined in the main genetically, but how we react to it is at least strongly influenced by upbringing and social custom. We pick up the manners of our social class, assuming them to be universal laws of good behavior. We have a natural tendency to emulate our parents, whether they're loving, decent, dutiful, or selfish, neglectful, and drunken. We obtain automatic and apparently indefeasible membership in our nation or ethnic group, together with a legacy of accompanying songs, myths, and stories. And all of these things, though they are external and pre-existing, are absorbed by our fledgling identity and become as much a part of us as our temperament, our IQs, or our digestion. Some of the most important elements in our identity are external, accidental, and above all social. From the point of view of the traditional, which I'll call also the religious view of identity, that's not a problem. Art, said Burke, art is man's nature, and man is a social animal who draws upon social materials when he builds his identity. Does this constitute an unnatural imposition on him? Not at all. Without the influence of society, a person's identity would be like Hobbes's description of natural society: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and I might add, speechless. The social elements in identity are the means whereby someone's material gifts, natural gifts, and dispositions are made manifest to the rest of the world. What is more, as we grow older, we grow increasingly discriminating in the use we make all of these elements in our identity. We reflect upon our condition and our circumstances. By the way, that is also why we cannot be successfully conditioned, because we reflect upon ourselves. We are always able to defeat an attempt at condition. We are not animals in that regard. We may, of course, loudly or quietly, reject some of the things our parents held dear. We may change our religion. We may take a more detached view of our country, changing our citizenship in some cases. We might learn a new set of manners, whether as a conscious social climbing or simply through exposure to a different social class. I now got two quotes from Bill and Shirley Letwin, which I think are really incredibly important, though apparently very theoretical. Bill Letwin wrote, "The environment is not an objective fact which can be assessed accurately by an objective observer. Instead, each individual largely shapes his own environment by emphasizing some of its aspects while ignoring others, by interpreting its manifestations according to his own beliefs, and by directly acting upon it." Or as his wife wrote in The Anatomy of Thatcherism, "A human being in possession of his facilities is never merely potter's clay, is never merely the something on which the environment has shaped. He is himself both potter and clay, because he necessarily decides what to make of whatever happens to him." I really want to quote that last sentence again from Shirley, because I think it's who is, by the way, I should add, she and Bill and Oliver, their son, who was in the British government, they're classic examples of Anglo-American conservatism, having been born in Chicago, of the Jewish religion, and having become pillars of the early movement of Thatcherism. But let me quote that last sentence, those two sentences again. "A human being in possession of his faculties is never merely potter's clay. He is himself both potter and clay, because he necessarily decides what to make of whatever happens to him." Okay, what's the person who does this shaping and choosing? What is the entity that draws upon the different materials in the environment and combines them with his own qualities to shape, and as time goes on, to reshape a particular individual identity? Now, the religious answer, I think my answer, and I believe yours, is the soul. A soul which is implicated in both the psychological dispositions of identity and the physical movements of the body. Not that the soul controls identity in a manipulative way, as a driver controls a train, but it is at the core of identity. Around it, consciousness, memory, genetic endowment, language, nationality, and all the rest form, so to speak, concentric trenches, inhabited by simultaneous translators, theologians, lawyers, strategists, games players, and above all, public relations advisors, through all of whom the soul deals with external reality. The result is an identity which, seen from outside, may have many facets, but which is nonetheless built around a single core. Now, for practical purposes, it makes little difference whether one calls this entity a soul or gives it some secular explanation, such as the Freudian trio of id, ego, and superego. What matters is both describe a central core of identity. Now, of course, I can't show you that entity under a microscope, and I'm aware that this account contradicts much of the current wisdom of psychology and philosophy. But it's also in accord with a psychological conviction that most people, including even the skeptical philosophers, seem to hold intuitively dear. So one has to ask skeptics some questions. If the psychological reality of identity includes these other qualities, including a feeling of free will and of moral responsibility for one's actions, even those actions which cannot be wholly remembered, as, for example, actions performed when drunk, how does this differ from a soul? And furthermore, if abandoning the supposed illusion of a soul leads to dangerous practical consequences, I shall now argue, should we not pause to consider those consequences before we throw out the psyche with the psychobabble? For it is this concept of a natural core of identity that the modern theories reject, and there are a variety of identities nominated to reject the traditional one. They all, however, begin by attempting to discredit the notion of a central core of identity as possessing a reality separate from its experiences. Hume is the beginning of the critics. He said as follows: "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble upon some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long am I insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. I may venture to assert of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle of collections of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. The mind is a kind of theatre, where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent, whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and that identity. Well, that's pretty clear. If there is no there, however, how can you account for the illusion of a there? Quite simply, that it is a false identity put there by other people, your parents, your neighbors, your countrymen, and if you are a child of 7 or under, the Jesuits. This false identity consists not only of the digested influence of class, nation, locality, sex, and so on, but also of the moral consciousness we feel to exist at the center of our being. So even if there is some kind of instinctual moral sense, as James Q. Wilson argues, the moral rules through which it expresses itself have been put there by other people, respectable society, your parents, the church. For one school of theorists, notably Marxism, liberation consists precisely of freeing yourself from this kind of false consciousness. According to the philosophers who were more radical than Marx, however, the man who liberates himself from this primitive prison of false identity does not therefore achieve autonomy. No such luck. He stumbles out onto a crowded stage, and he is there handed a variety of masks, which he assumes in response to the hints, shouts, murmurs, and prompts from other actors in the play, a play jointly co-authored by David Hume and Luigi Pirandello. I have a quote here, which is just too long, really, from Pirandello, but it ends up with one of the second character saying, "In other words, you are a different person for each of us." Now, here is a world in which identities are created by situations. What holds a personality together really is a set of skills for coping with external reality. Identities are mere roles or masks we use to deal with other people, in which case, of course, our identities are in effect created by others in a much more radical sense than in the theories of Freud or Marx. In the primitive notion of false consciousness, the villains plant their ideas in our heads and then depart, leaving us with our personal neuroses or reactionary social ideas to control us. But in the more radical versions, other people are constantly rewiring the inside of our heads. These ideas have spread widely in philosophy, in sociology, psychology, and of course in dinner table conversation. But of course the man who has produced the most effective and persuasive version of this is Woody Allen in his film Zelig, the story of a man so responsive to the expectations of others and responsive too to the influences of social environment that he becomes in succession a radical communist, a Hooverite conservative, an Orthodox Jew, and a Nazi. And of course he is able to assume all these various identities convincingly because of an inner emptiness, the lack of an authentic identity of his own. Here then is the existential choice we are offered by the modern theory of identity. We can either be the puppets of other people, dummies surrounded by ventriloquists, or we can be the landlords of a vacant lot. Now, that's an intolerable choice, but it comes accompanied by an attractive escape hatch. If other people can insert a false identity into the empty space in my head, can I perhaps insert an authentic identity in there? Authentic because it is rationally chosen and consciously shaped by me, rather than being merely a psychological given that I gradually discover in adolescence and childhood. And the principle upon which the new identity can be selected is the best bonus of all. That principle has been laid down by America's greatest living psychologist, namely Tom Wolfe, in his essay, The Me Decade. It began life as an advertising slogan for a shampoo. If I have only one life to live, let me lead it as a blonde. The charm of this principle is that for constructing a new identity is that it is infinitely accommodating. It enables us to say to ourselves, if I have only one life to live, let me lead it as, and then you can fill in the blank. So, to the old question, is there a ghost in the machine? The answer is no, but there is a consumer. The consumer selects his new identity from the range of moral possibilities that the modern world throws up. In its simplest form, this identity is constructed by selecting one facet of someone's real identity, given identity, and elevating it to the whole, or at least to a dominant part of the personality. George Orwell's reviewed Sartre's Portrait of an Anti-Semite as follows. The anti-Semite Sartre seems to imply all through the book is always the same kind of person, recognizable at a glance and, so to speak, in action the whole time. Actually, one has to use only a little observation to see that anti-Semitism, in any but the worst cases, is intermittent. But this would not square with Mr. Sartre's atomized view of society. There is, he comes near to saying, no such thing as a human being. There are only different categories of men, such as the worker, the bourgeois, all classifiable in much the same way as insects. Now, a recent example of that kind of identity building is, I think, the gay identity. For someone who announces he is gay is not simply someone who has a homosexual disposition. He is someone who is making homosexuality the basis of an entire personality and outlook, morals, politics, and social relations. This will tend to make him or her hostile to societies traditionally organized to favor heterosexuality and the family, and persuade him to advocate policies that seek not tolerance, but the transformation of popular or traditional attitudes towards homosexuality. Needless to say, this kind of response is by no means universal among homosexuals. Even today, when pressures such as outing try to enforce a gay identity, many of them take the view that homosexuality is just one facet of their identity, whether an advantage or a curse or simply a slightly awkward fact about themselves. Their support for sexual reform will tend to go no further than social tolerance and the repeal of punitive laws. They may find the idea of a gay identity mysterious, alien, and too narrow to express their entire personality, and even repellent, as Noel Coward on several occasions makes the point in his diaries. Now, let me just make, I think, the second important theoretical point. Self-conscious identity building is very different from the argument earlier of Bill and Shelley Letwin that traditional identity could be modified by the reason deciding to emphasize some aspects of one's environment at the expense of others. The difference is subtle but important, and it has immense consequences. It's the difference between piecemeal self-improvement of the personality and the wholesale reconstruction of the personality. We all go in for piecemeal reform, particularly on New Year's Day. Someone attempting it will usually refer to what he is doing in modest terms. I'm trying to be more punctual. Someone engaged in ideological reconstruction of the entire self will see it in much more dramatic, even religious terms, as becoming an entirely different kind of human being. He will be remaking himself in accordance with some revelation, either some new principle of reason outside himself, or some inner prompting of the personality, or even both, some impulse extracted from inside himself and expanded into a universal truth about human nature. Thus, a lesbian, uncomfortable with conventional femininity, will eventually be struck by the blinding revelation that all gender roles are socially constructed. Now, such illumination is not confined to the left. You get self-conscious identity politics on the political right as well. My own view is that the ideological definition of American nationality, the claim that America is unlike other nations in that its nationality is neither ethnic nor cultural, but consists of embracing the principles of liberty and equality set out in the Declaration and embodied in the Constitution, I think that's a mistake. To be sure, there is undoubtedly a very important element of ideology in American nationality, which the Declaration in particular dramatizes. But that ideology, important though it is merely the conscious political expression, I might almost say the conscious political distillation of a much more extensive national culture, which is itself the result of a common language, history, institutions, and overall the shared experience of living in the same territory. An episode in the Second World War is instructive here. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commandos were roaming around in American uniforms, and GIs had to work out who were the Americans and who were not. So they asked them questions to test their Americanism. Did they ask them their view of equality or the rights of popular government? Of course not. I mean, mere ideas of that kind could be parroted, indeed genuinely believed by non-Americans, though not, of course, by Nazis. No, they asked them details of American life in the broadest cultural context. Who was the winner of the previous World Series? What was the advertising jingle on the radio for certain goods? The capital of their home state, Mae West's bus measurement. In short, the kind of things that every American would know, but that a foreigner could not easily study. In his book on that battle, Gerald Astor describes how two Allied generals coped. General Omar Bradley said, "I was 3 times ordered to prove my identity by cautious GIs. The first time by identifying Springfield as the capital of Illinois. My questioner held out for Chicago. The second time by locating the guard between the center and tackle on a line of scrimmage. The third time by naming the then current spouse of a blonde called Betty Grable. Betty Grable stopped me." The correct answer, by the way, was band leader Harry James. But the sentry did not. Pleased at having stopped me, he passed me on. General Montgomery, on the other hand, imperiously directed his driver to ignore the sentry. The guard then shot out the tires of his car and held the British commander for several hours. Apparently, when he heard of the incident, Eisenhower enjoyed one of his few laughs during the battle. And not to let the British side down, they stopped David Niven, too, who was then, of course, a British commando, and asked him, what was it? I think it was who'd won the World Series. "Haven't the foggiest," said Niven, "but I did star with Ginger Rogers in Bachelor Mother." And that got him through. Now, obviously, how can you become an American in the cultural sense? And of course, the answer is yes, by living in the country. You might begin, but when you take your citizenship, you will be almost an American, it seems to me, but very, very quickly, if you live in the country and you love it, you will be more and more shaped by the American experience. And the problem is, if you define Americanism down to certain principles of politics, then somebody's American commitment would wax and wane in response to the course both of American history and of his own convictions. Suppose that America fails to live up to his political views, or suppose he changes those views. Very likely, any kind of consistent philosopher would be feeling twinges of disloyalty by the end of the first week. Once identity becomes a matter of conscious choice and decision, they can't be eliminated from the concept, but they can't be the dominant thing. A Rubicon is crossed. For there are more radical ways of creating a new identity, whether national or sexual, than by overemphasizing one's given identity or a facet, and by accommodating oneself to some external vision. One can adopt another kind of identity entirely. Thus, transvesticism is a halfway house of bisexual identity politics. Transsexualism is the more radical assertion that one can choose not merely to ape another sexual identity, but even to embrace it in the fullest sense. Now, when I first encountered these kind of arguments about 20 odd years ago, I assumed that was a completely academic issue, that example was almost a reductio ad absurdum. But the bathroom controversy has shown that such thinking is now sufficiently important as to be able to remake public policy. More important, it signifies that even nature is no longer seen as a constraint upon identity, because literally nothing is impossible for someone determined to become his own creator. Now, given if that is the spirit of the age, which it seems to me has been for some time, then we can hardly expect such metaphysical ventures to be left to individual enterprise. And indeed, American bureaucrats have created entire ethnic identities by strokes of the pen. In 1973, in order to establish a rational structure for affirmative action, the Office of Management and Budget promulgated Statistical Directive Number 15, dividing Americans into 5 ethnic groups, of which the most creative construction is Hispanic. Now, Hispanics are not a national group. They include Cubans, Mexicans, Colombians, Chileans, and Spaniards. Nor are they a racial category. Actually, they don't include Spaniards. I take that back. For some reason, that's been left out. Nor are they a racial category, because they cover whites, blacks, and Amerindians. Nor, and this did surprise me, are they even a linguistic category, because they include people with Spanish surnames from families which have not spoken Spanish for generations, or in the case of some Amerindians, from families that have never spoken Spanish at all. But once you create such a category, that begins to have certain practical advantages. You might be the beneficiary of a quota system, or you might receive money from the Ford Foundation to advance Hispanic interests. There are now, therefore, a considerable number of Americans, generally in academia, but not exclusively so, who think of themselves as possessing this Hispanic identity in a profound sense. Indeed, if they don't, other people will impose it on them. Linda Chavez pointed out it's quite difficult for someone with a Spanish surname to escape being educated in Spanish in public schools, even if they can't speak the language or they are sent off to learn the culture. The bureaucrats insist that they must be brought up for the sake of their authentic identity in their own culture, even if it isn't their culture, and indeed, insofar as it's a hybrid Hispanic culture, may not be anyone's culture. Can we see any common elements uniting these proliferating invented identities? I think I want to suggest 3. First, they are stark and impoverished compared to the taken for granted given identities, which we all used to share, so to speak. Second, they are self-conscious and therefore precarious. And third, as the late Kenneth Minogue used to point out, they always become the adversaries of traditional identities. It goes almost without saying. It goes almost without saying that an identity built upon one facet of a personality will be impoverished alongside the richness of an identity that reflects the full range of influences upon a life. The Marxist categories of proletarian and bourgeois are useless except as economic categories. An identity based upon the fact that you work for wages and are alienated from the product of your labor is not really an identity at all. If a young Marxist intellectual were to ask you or me about what he should do to live a good proletarian life, what advice would we give him? It would certainly not include, say, the breeding of racing pigeons or buying a garden allotment, though both are important elements of a working class life in northern England. Compare, on the other hand, the richness of traditional social identities, like that, for instance, of the gentleman. As Shirley Letwin demonstrates in her book, and I'm very influenced by Shirley, The Gentleman in Trollope, this is a subject yielding not only sharp and subtle observations and satires, but also a rich vein of moral criticism. One might say, in relation to our topic, that The Gentleman in Letwin is the highest example of moral reason operating piecemeal to improve the personality from the material within it. False social identities, which tend to reconstruct the personality in accord with some ideal, inevitably produce a one-dimensional man. The Soviet proletarian, for instance, an examination of whose moral character can sustain nothing more complex than a cartoon or a socialist realist painting, hard to distinguish from a cartoon. Second, in addition to being thin, invented identities are also precarious. The more natural our identity is, the more we take it for granted. Self-consciousness is the constant companion of an uncertain identity. We are self-conscious on entering the room at someone's party, for example, conscious of other people's need and enjoyment when we give a party at home. A good example of this in literature is the hero of Thomas Mann's Felix Krull. Krull, the hero, is traveling in a comfortable first-class train compartment. For all intents and purposes, a young aristocrat. As a train attendant is leaving his compartment after serving him, Krull smiles at him, a smile, he says, that assuredly confirmed him in his conservative principles to the point where he would gladly have fought and died for them. The point, however, is that Krull is not a young aristocrat. He's a confidence trickster. It's extremely doubtful whether a real aristocrat would feel those kind of things or react in that way. He would be less conscious of his impact, flaunting his identity only when expected marks of deference were not paid to him. But the confidence man has to calculate such effects with precision, because his hold on that aristocratic identity is precarious. Hence the phenomenon of the marginal patriot, the outsider who seeks to demonstrate his commitment to, say, a national identity by being more nationalistic than thou. John Stevenson, a Paddington-born man of uncertain ancestry, became, therefore, Sean McSteefoyne, the Chief of Staff of the IRA in the 1970s. McSteefoyne succeeded heroically, or rather anti-heroically, in his identity as an Irish patriot, going so far as to launch a hunger strike. Near death, however, he gave up the strike, at which point his IRA colleagues realized that he'd been an Englishman all along. His Irish identity has always been precarious. It depended upon his performing heroic feats. And third and most significant, the invented identity is parasitic and adversarial with respect to the real thing. An invented identity will model itself on an existing one. This might provoke some controversy among you. Homosexual families mimic traditional families by copying the parental role and demanding such perquisites as pension rights for domestic partners. But they are simply unable to form traditional aspects of this role, like childbearing, and very often unwilling to accept its traditional disciplines, such as sexual fidelity. Invented national identities, similarly, copy the outward shell of real nations. For instance, the European Union has acquired a flag, an anthem, a citizenship, and even beginning to acquire an army, without the prior substance of a single European people with a sense of community and allegiance. But though they may be fraudulent, these imitations of identity weaken the real identities, whether of family or of nation, by sucking the significance out of the practices that traditionally bolster the identities. If, for instance, unofficial and transient relationships have their financial arrangements underpinned by the state, then the family derives no special significance from the fact that its own arrangements are similarly protected. That is one reason, in my view, why we should have to be skeptical of same-sex marriage. But the hostility of the invented identity goes beyond this parasitism. As Kenneth Minogue has pointed out in Alien Powers, the first impulse of someone who has thrown off his old identity and embraced a new one is an evangelical impulse. He wants to tell everyone that once he was blind, that now he sees, but that they are still blind. And what he sees is that his old identity was a fraud and an imposition, and therefore their current identity still is. Hence, new identities tend to attack or seek to replace their counterparts among existing ones. The gay or feminist identity will define itself by opposition to the traditional sexual identities of male and female. These it will decry as socially constructed, and consequently false and oppressive. In the jargon, heterosexism. In the case of national loyalties, a rivalry between ideological nationalism, which was, I thought, analyzed with devastating irony by Elie Kaddouri in his classic book on nationalism, that the rivalry between ideological nationalisms and taken for granted hand-me-down ethno-cultural traditions can be especially vicious. For pre-existing loyalties are seen often as an obstacle to the new national identity that is striving to be born and proselytized. Thus, the Euro-nationalism of Brussels is constantly engaged in polemics against its rivals in the traditional patriotisms of France, Britain, and other European countries, which it blames for past wars, racism, and all the fashionable vices. The strong and hostile response of some Remainers to the Brexit result is a case in point. Some Remainers, and some of the most sophisticated Remainers, have not only denounced the result, they have gone on to denounce democracy itself, and those who voted Leave as old, stupid people who shouldn't be allowed to have the franchise. They've even been known to ask leavers to leave dinner parties when their views were revealed. A very old-fashioned form of coercion, seems to me. It seems as if the more sophisticated remainders had already adopted a European identity ahead of the people, the utmost of people, and experienced the result, therefore, as an obstacle to that identity, even a removal of it from them, and rather than simply as an unwelcome political decision. And in the United States, I would say that the theory that America is a nation of immigrants held together only by allegiance to liberal political ideals is in a state of constant tension with the actual American historical identity. For it implies that America is the whole world in microcosm, that everyone is in principle an American, and that therefore America's actual culture and identity is merely the property of an ethnic group or a temporary majority, and does not deserve to be privileged as the culture of the whole society. That, of course, contrasts dramatically with the argument in Who Are We by Samuel Huntington, that the American national identity starts out as the identity of the WASPs, but with every arrival of a new immigrant group, that identity is influenced. It adopts some of the words, some of the concepts, some of the ideals, some of the loyalties of the new immigrant groups, with the result that we see that, well, his comparison is you start with tomato soup, every new group that arrives adds different kinds of vegetable, and you end up with a delicious, rich soup with still a kind of tomato soup at the end of it. I would say, can we possibly imagine the English language today without the influence of Yiddish upon it, which has been transmitted by Hollywood and which produces now among everybody from Australian bushwhackers to English aristocrats, a constant use of words which are plainly derived from the Jewish influence on New York. Why does all this matter? One might suppose that a theory holding that identity is infinitely plastic, a succession of masks chosen in response to the applause of others as much as for the satisfaction of oneself, would tend to social peace. After all, have not conflicts until now been clashes between the hard and supposedly unyielding aspects of hard identities, of class, of ethnicity? Surely a widespread acceptance of the malleability of identity would lead to tolerance of other people, of other identities, as equally valid or bogus as one's own. May it not lead perhaps to the construction of a super identity of tolerance into which all these identity subcultures could comfortably coexist, a kind of Austria-Hungary of moral visions, in which the ruling power demands only the mildest of allegiances, one easily compatible with the identity's integrity. But it doesn't seem to be working out that way. Social conflict between different groups seems to be multiplying in lockstep with the increased popularity of the idea of malleable identity. And we can imagine why. There are more identities around to begin with. A plastic identity, in principle, is arbitrary and limitless. There is literally no group, however arbitrarily selected, which cannot conceive of itself as possessing one and thus forming a particular community. Indeed, the number of groups which claim some such basis for identity are multiplying rapidly. The late Aaron Wildavsky once calculated, tongue-in-cheek, that groups of this kind, including women, blacks, Eskimos, Hispanics, and the disabled, added up to more than 300% of the American people. But the number of initials that are now added to LGBT demonstrates how far we can go into making preferences into identities. Even the process of expansion can sometimes provoke conflict when some members of the group have no wish to share in the preferred identity and the group as a whole seeks to bring them into line. Thus, the outing of homosexuals, private homosexuals by gay activists, became just such a conflict a few years ago. Still more extravagant, some ideologies have argued that the deaf are a self-conscious community with their own language, culture, and identity. Spokesmen for their organization have at times denounced attempts to enable the deaf to hear as cultural genocide. They've even lobbied the federal government to prevent the parents of deaf children from relieving their deafness to an operation, through an operation. I should honestly say that the chairman of the group that made this recommendation was not himself deaf. More significantly, identity is not just about how we feel about ourselves. To be truly satisfying, our identity needs to be recognized by others. Yet imagine how difficult it must be for some of the groups now in existence to be treated as possessing real identities by the rest of society. There is in New York, or was a few years ago, a group of sadists and masochists who, according to New York Magazine, formed the Eulenspiegel Society as a masochist rights group. Sadists were admitted later, doubtless the first expression of the masochist rights. In an absolutely wonderful paradox, they complain that they are oppressed by society because they are forced to conceal their lifestyles. Now, such forms of identity politics promise long-running cultural wars. There is little prospect that most people, even those privately attracted by such practices, will ever be prepared to grant any kind of respectable status to them. These groups will continue to push for legal recognition and otherwise, and when the demand is resisted, or even when it is conceded without enthusiasm, the disappointed group will seek to force a stronger acceptance from others. As John Gray has pointed out, tolerance is no longer enough criticizing the view, tolerance is no longer enough because it implies that the thing tolerated merits disapproval. And disapproval will seem especially damaging, hostile, vicious, when your identity is at stake. If a practice someone performs or a belief he holds excites disapproval, he may be wounded or bitter. If his very identity excites disapproval, he will become outraged and demand a more substantive critic surrender by his critics, perhaps even the repression of their objections, hate speech. In this context, you might say, for example, the pedophiles want to make us cry uncle. They're a long way from success as yet, but on the other hand, there's been quite a success in creating the idea of homophobia, namely that moral disapproval of homosexuality is a psychological disorder, the main symptom of which is being accused of it. What maximizes the likelihood of conflict is, and this will be my last point, I think, yes. I'm just finishing this point. When modern psychologists and modernist writers began deconstructing what they thought was the prison of a rigid and unreflecting identity, they plainly thought they were liberating citizens to stroll about in free and equal relationships without bumping into the barriers of race, gender, ethnicity, and class. What they were in fact doing was laying down the epistemological ground for a low-intensity moral civil war. Ladies and gentlemen, you and I are living in the consequences. Thank you.